reporting already.
I talk about clinical research in imaging and the elements for success that allow us as medical imagers to participate and contribute to successful clinical research. Think about this course as if someone tried to give you a 9-minute overview of radiation safety. You know, in 90 minutes you would never be able to become an RSO. You know, you wouldn't even really know everything you needed to do in order to perform a job of a neuромedicine or technologist. But it would be an overview of things to point to, things to be aware of, some of the pitfalls, and where you can get additional information if you're interested. That's what we want to do with this course. In 9 minutes, we're not going to be able to teach you how to be a study coordinator. We're not going to teach you how to be an investigator in a clinical trial. But we'll have an overview of some very important terms that are used in clinical research so that your communication between your expertise of medical imaging and the expertise of others in clinical trials can be improved and be optimized, and you'll know where to go if you want more information. And so far, as you see here, identify some terms. We're going to talk about some procedures, talk about the protocol, what that means and how it differs from other study documents, and some of the responsibilities, particularly the responsibility of the investigator, and distinguish adverse events from serious adverse events, and where, when, and how to report them. We won't have this theme throughout this talk about the language of clinical trials, because just like in something like radiation safety, acronyms and knowing how to describe things becomes very important. If you don't know the acronyms, you can be completely let out of important content. And not to stress that throughout the talk that you're going to use definitions, and it's going to allow increased efficiency for study start, hopefully, more accurate and effective communication, new understanding, better preparation for FDA audits and sponsor audits, which is very important as a clinical imaging professional doing clinical trials. And level, hopefully this will build a bridge between molecular imaging and clinical research colleagues. Colleagues who do clinical trials in oncology, neurology, gastroenterology, whichever, they speak a particular language about sponsored clinical trials, and you'll be able to be more effective in your communication with them. To start with the definition of GCP, I'm wondering if many of you have heard of GCP. If you go through your IRB training course, you've heard of GCP. And for good clinical practice, it's an international, ethical, and scientific quality standard for all the things involved in research, including designing, conducting, reporting, and recording trial data that involves the participation of human patients. Compliance with this standard is about public assurance that safety and well-being of trial patients are protected and clinical trial data are credible. The GCP is actually kind of written and governed by an organization called International Conference on Harmonization, which is abbreviated as ICH. And you can see there the website for ICH if you want to take a look at what everything the ICH offers. It's a tremendous resource for clinical research information. The Code of Federal Regulations in the United States government, as seen in www.fda.gov, also recommends and refers to clinical practices, as do the Department of Health and Human Services, the ethical principles that go into all these regulations. All of these things up into what are good clinical practices. Either sponsor, the drug manufacturer or maybe device manufacturer that is working with you on research, has standard operating procedures that specifically are in effect to make sure that we follow good clinical practices. And so good clinical practices is kind of an overarching governmental governance, not governmental as much, but a governance of how we do clinical trials in the most ethical way. There's a rule, another piece of a definition to learn. There's a rule called the common rule. And the common rule is actually the overarching research where any institution in the U.S. that gets federal funding. And so if you work in a university hospital that gets any federal funding, you're governed by the common rule. The rule influences a lot of things such as research in military, research for dentistry and psychiatry, for example. It was in 1991, so it's not that old, really. 91 is, as old as you might think it would be. It's influenced by the Belmont Report. You'll hear when you about clinical research about this report called the Belmont Report, and it was in the mid-1970s, and it was adopted by the U.S. federal government as well as many international groups. A definitive document on the ethics of doing clinical research in human subjects. It talks about autonomy, justice, and beneficence, and about how we protect patients while they're in the research process. The Belmont Report definitely influenced this regulation called the Common Rule. The rule has been codified by 15 federal departments or agencies. It defines the basic provisions for IRBs, informed consent, and assurances of compliance. And as you said, the three things that come to play from the Belmont Report are respect, beneficence, and justice, or autonomy is another way to say respect for person. Beneficence meaning do good, and justice. The compliance to good clinical practices is something anyone who is participating in clinical research should pay attention to. Research personnel, and that means even nuclear medicine techs who are participating in research, biopharmacists who are participating in research, anyone who is doing any testing, the person who does the EKG, the person who does the stress testing, all these individuals should be aware of the commitments and responsibilities defined in the regulation. In particular, the principal or primary investigator signed a document called FDA Form 1572, which you'll hear abbreviated just as 1572. Excuse me, that's a document between the PI and the federal government that says, I'm going to abide by good clinical practices and all the regulations that are involved in research. International regulatory agencies also give sponsors and investigators a set of regulations and guidelines. But it's important to note that no two sponsoring companies are exactly identical with how they interpret these requirements. So you may be doing two different sponsored trials, and one sponsor says, I must have the original 1572 document. I can't take a copy. Another sponsor says you can scan in a copy. Things that are how a sponsor is going to interpret what responsibilities are under the regulation. The overarching regulation tells you what needs to happen in terms of being the rules for clinical trials. The ICH, the International Council on Harmonization, the organization that has written the good clinical practices. The mission of the ICH is to achieve harmonization among people who do clinical research throughout the world. It brings together regulatory authorities and the pharma industry of Europe, Japan, and the U.S. to discuss scientific and technical aspects of drug registration. Meaning the filing that you would do with a regulatory agency in order to obtain approval to market that drug. The International Council on Harmonization has published documents and has expertise in the areas of quality, safety, efficacy, and then kind of a catch-all category called multidisciplinary. Weekly, when we teach about GCPs in doing clinical trials, we teach about the E section, efficacy, the design, conduct, safety, reporting of clinical trials. Other sections of ICH, though, if you're an investigator, are very much of interest to understand what the leading thinkers have to say about how to conduct clinical trials. But today, we're going to focus on this E section of efficacy. So this E section, in particular, document number 6 in the efficacy section of the ICH document, was finalized in 1996, describes the responsibilities and expectations of all participants in a clinical trial, and it's interesting that these participants follow these principles when doing clinical trials that are intended to be submitted to the regulatory agencies. More and more, people who are doing clinical trials, maybe not for registration, but other purposes, such as some very early research studies to determine whether or not someone is going to file for registration, we also have the GCP device. GCP E6 document was published in the Federal Register by codifying this international document, something that the United States considers to be part of the regulation. In addition to the GCP being codified into the federal regulations, the section in the federal regulations, which is Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 312, that talks very much in detail about the responsibilities of a sponsor and an investigator to submit data for registration of a new drug. This section 21 CFR Part 312 is as familiar to pharmaceutical professionals as any radiation regulation would be familiar to us as nuclear medicine professionals. And you might be thinking, well, there's this GCP thing, E6, there are the FDA regulations, one do I follow? And it's important to understand that you need to understand both, that pharmaceutical professionals walk through both worlds. They understand that the ICH GCP document E6 provides a really stringent deadline for good quality research, that the FDA may issue citations against what are in the federal regulations. So it's really important to understand both. And does study oversight. So we talked about the GCP, not an agency of the GCP that comes out and audits you. Is the ICH is a part of this principle, which everyone has adopted, but many countries have adopted into clinical trials. Okay, actually has an oversight responsibility for studies that are done in the U.S. So the FDA says that they must protect public health by the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, medical devices, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. Products emit radiation may or may not be medical devices. Typically, when we have PET scanners and gamma cameras, they go under the medical device category, and typically when we have radiopharmaceutical, it goes under the human drugs category. But there are times when something like a radioisotope tagged monoclonal antibody, for example, go in the biological products category. But to be advanced public health by speeding innovation, regulate manufacturing of these things of tobacco products, and ensure security of the food supply. So those are some of the oversight responsibilities of the FDA. And the FDA also said there needs to be an institutional review board. the Institutional Review Board was introduced in the Common Rule, and 21 CFR actually does go into some detail at Part 10 about what makes up the Institutional Review Board. I think most of us in imaging have heard of IRBs. I don't need to spend a lot of time on that. To know that, in addition, when you're trying to get a protocol approved, often lately we see additional reviewing bodies, scientific review committees, that have to approve some things. Maybe there's an oncology review committee that has to review oncology-related protocols before it even gets to the IRB, et cetera. Those serve a very important function because, as you can see, the Institutional Review Board is not necessarily made up of subject matter experts who could discern what is a good cancer study and what is not, whereas the Scientific Review Committee will be able to know, because they're subject matter experts, that, for example, this study was already done, it doesn't need to be repeated, or this study doesn't make good scientific sense. So most institutions now have gone to this kind of dual review process. Gotten through the language about the oversight of clinical research and move into the people who do clinical research and the organization. The definition to go over is sponsor. A lot more than the person who writes the check. We think sponsor as the financial backer of a clinical trial. That's often true, but the real definition of sponsor from a regulatory perspective. The sponsor is an individual, company, or organization that's responsible for initiation and management of a clinical trial. They think of the idea, they write the protocol, they do how the study will be conducted, they manage the study. Of course, can also be a corporation or agency whose employees conduct the investigation. In that case, a sponsor is the company and the employees are considered investigators. A clinical trial agreement is a document that's signed by an investigator, and it is an agreement between the sponsor and the investigator. It's actually a legally binding contract, and so most sponsors will not initiate a clinical trial until there is a contract in place. An additional document that the sponsor asks an investigator to sign is the protocol signature page. That actually certifies that the investigator will comply with the information within the protocol and will not do things that are not in the protocol. CO is a term that you will have heard when you talk about research. CO means Contract Research Organization. Some people call it a clinical research organization. That's not wrong in the sense that many CROs do clinical research, but CROs do other things as well. So contract research organization, and you have a CRO that focuses on data, or a CRO that focuses on imaging in particular, but that's a person or organization that's crafted by the study sponsor to perform one or more of these functions of the clinical trial. So, for example, the CRO may collect the data from the site. It manage enrollment for the site. It may, if it's an imaging CRO, it may collect the study images and do analysis on the study images. There's a term that sometimes these individuals work for the CRO and sometimes they work directly for the sponsor. And that is a CRA, Clinical Research Associate, CRA, Certified Clinical Research Associate, or CRP, Certified Clinical Research Physician. A CRA or a CCRA are sometimes also referred to as a monitor. Individuals are people that are employed by either the sponsor or the CRO to monitor the progress of the clinical trial and to determine that compliance the protocol and GCP guidelines is taking place. So if you're doing a sponsored clinical trial, there will be a person or multiple people who are your monitor, sometimes called the CRA, that will come out to your site and look at original data to make sure that you're complying with the study protocol. Now, Principal Investigator is something we intuitively in medical imaging understand. It's the individual who actually conducts the clinical trial. But some of the things that we need to be very aware of in medical imaging is that the principal investigator can designate of the clinical trial team to perform trial-related procedures or to make important trial-related decisions. They are considered to be supervised by the principal investigator who's ultimately responsible. So you're doing a sponsored clinical trial is an imaging agent. The medicine physician might be the principal investigator for the study. But doing a clinical trial, an oncology study or neurology study, may be a principal investigator who is not even in the nuclear medicine department, who essentially delegates trial-related procedures to other individuals, other physicians who will oversee the procedures. We sometimes use the term co-investigator. That is, I think, how co-legally the principal investigator and the other investigators to each other. But from a federal regulations perspective, there's one person who's in charge. That's the PI. The qualifications of the PI are very, very important. And one of the things that the sponsor does is document these qualifications, and you may have gone through this having to collect CVs and medical licenses on any individual who's going to participate in the trial. The sub-investigators who report up to the PI also usually have to document their education and training. The PI has to be someone with the education, training, and experience to assume responsibility. So, for example, you're not going to have an ophthalmologist be a principal investigator for a gastroenterology trial. It wouldn't be appropriate because they wouldn't have the experience and training to assume responsibility for that trial. They have to have familiarity with the investigational part, and they have to have the ability to oversee the sub-investigators and the personnel participating in the trial. The responsibilities of the PI are to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of subjects. And rights, safety, and welfare of subjects is a theme throughout the GCPs and throughout the federal regulations. And that involves obtaining informed consent from subjects, using an informed consent form that is IRB approved. The PI is also responsible for medical care of subjects, responsible for all trial-related medical decisions, including care for adverse events or other illnesses. And the PI is responsible for determining the reason that any subject would withdraw from the study. The PI has the responsibility to ensure that the IRB is compliant. The PI has the responsibility to make sure that they follow the common rules. It has to submit all scheduled reports to the IRB on time and avoid any lapses in renewal, and to report serious adverse events and protocol deviations, which are definitions we'll talk about shortly in this talk, immediately after they know about them, to IRB, sponsor, and the regulatory agencies as required. Clinical Research Coordinator, we've used a lot of acronyms, but the Clinical Research Coordinator, or CRC, sometimes it's called the study nurse, sometimes just the study coordinator or the clinical study coordinator. It's a very important individual in the conduct of a clinical trial. They act as a liaison between the site, the sponsor, regulatory agencies, and on behalf of a site investigator, handle most of the administrative responsibilities of the trial. the clinical research coordinator often conducts the informed consent process with a potential research subject, and they review and prepare all data and records prior to a monitor's visit or regulatory audit. Now, typically, if the study is not a medical imaging study, but is a study for another department such as neurology, the primary research coordinator is not a nuclear medicine tech or a PET tech. It's usually someone who is in that area who works for the principal investigator, whether an oncologist, neurologist, etc. But a study is an imaging trial where what you are testing is a new imaging agent. The primary study coordinator can be a member of that group if the PI is from a department. So if there is a nuclear medicine or PET physician who is doing a research study on the efficacy of a new PET imaging agent, then that primary investigator may have a study coordinator that they work with. We talked the people involved in clinical trials. Now, let's back and look at some of the documents and materials that you have heard of before, but maybe haven't had an in-depth exposure to. Protocol. The term protocol in nuclear medicine departments really quite briefly, and we typically mean a step-by-step instruction of what we're going to do in terms of the scan. But it's important to understand that in a clinical research study, the protocol has much more than what we're going to do in a scan. It's an overarching document that describes the objectives of the trial, the design, the methods you're going to use to collect data, how you have determined the statistical significance of your findings, and how you're going to organize the trial. And the clinical study protocol doesn't have a lot of detail about medical imaging. It may say in the document, well, a CT scan every 6 months, and that might be what it says. Or it may PET FDG to be repeated 1 month after therapy, and it doesn't give any details about how to acquire that scan. The imaging or scanning protocol is a separate manual, and those details are rarely defined in the clinical study protocol, and that's done for a reason. The protocol is an approved document that has to go through IRB review for any changes, where an imaging manual or an imaging protocol is something that can be more nimble and respond to specific technical requirements and issues. The SAE reporting form, the Serious Adverse Event Reporting Form, is usually a separate document. And then a protocol amendment is used when there needs to be a change to the protocol. It's a written description of a change or a formal clarification of a study-related item in the protocol must be approved by the IRB. So you've got a clinical protocol that within it doesn't have much detail about scanning, because anytime you want to make a change to the clinical protocol, you have to go through this process of a protocol amendment. That's one of the reasons why we typically keep it in a separate document. Clinical protocol, per the federal regulations, must contain these things: the objectives and purpose, criteria for inclusion and exclusion, as well as an estimate of the number of patients to be studied, and a description of the design of the study, and that includes how you are going to ensure that investigators are not biased and are biased on the part of determining the success of the drug. The design of the study, in words, a randomized control study or a double study or a study with multiple arms, writes into the protocol or builds into the protocol a method for minimizing the potential of bias on the part of the investigator. The protocol has to determine a dose to be administered and how that dose was come up with. Why did you say it should be 10 millicuries of FLT Why not 8? Why not 25? The plan's maximum dosage and the duration of any individual's exposure to the study drug. Observations of the study have to be included, including an explanation of what they are and what will be measured. For example, blood chemistry will be measured every 6 weeks for the first 12 months of the study, etc. And there has to be a description of clinical procedures. And this is typically where imaging procedures fall into place, is when in the section about description of clinical procedures. Again, not a lot of data usually on how it's going to be obtained, but it may say, PET scan to be taken or to be obtained every 6 months or something like that. That said, that the clinical protocol is different than the imaging manual. The manual is not really written into the federal regulations or the DCP. Nothing in the regulations you're going to say that have an imaging manual. But authors who do clinical trials that utilize medical imaging, which are quite a few, most drug studies nowadays include some section of medical imaging, whether it's a chest X-ray as an exclusion criteria or a CT before the patient enrolls. Most sponsors do use imaging, typically an imaging manual that contains the details. But IRBs now review the imaging manuals as well as the therapeutic protocol. And personnel must be aware of all imaging requirements prior to scanning the first patient. A really important point. You may have been told, yes, we're doing an oncology for Dr. So-and-so. They're going to come in and get an SBG scan the week before and 6 weeks after this new chemotherapy agent. What dose are you going to use? What is the time post-injection that you scan the SBG patient? How are you going to archive the data? What data does the sponsor want? There are blood draws that are required at baseline and after the scan, etc. As an imaging personnel, you need to be aware of the exact protocol because it's often not done as standard of care. Now, you will have protocols where it will literally say PET-CT done standard of care. In that case, you would do your routine departmental protocol. But more often than not, it's intended to be standard of care. They actually want to standardize images across multiple different sites using multiple different cameras, and therefore they meaning the sponsor or the CRO, will have spelled out exactly how to acquire the study, down to which matrix, down to which filters, down to the exact method of injection. So it's very important to understand what is in the imaging manual and that you get a good look at it prior to a patient being scheduled. These other things that may be in the imaging manual, how to prepare the patient. Maybe it's different than standard of care. Image acquisition parameters, maybe it's different. Maybe you're supposed to acquire a dynamic study, for example. Maybe your post-processing is supposed to be done a certain way to help the sponsor scan images across 5 different sites. You're required to de-identify the scans when they get sent in and label them after you've removed the patient's label. How are you going to transmit the images, archive the images? And particularly in studies like in oncology, when there is a tumor measurement involved, such as RECIST or PERSIST, how are you going to perform those measurements? Or for neurology, for example, if there's a quantitation, or for cardiology, if there's some form of quantitation to be applied, what is to be applied and exactly how is it to be done? So the things about the protocol and the imaging manual, and let's talk now about the informed consent. For studies subject to FDA regulations, the informed consent document has to meet these requirements in a particular place of a Code of Federal Regulations, 21 Part 50, and there have to be the 8 basic elements appropriate to the study. There are courses on informed consent, and certainly this talk won't go through all of the details, but just have an understanding that these documents are fairly well scripted as to what is required to meet federal regulations. ARB is the final authority for whether or not your consent form is appropriate. So we'll frequently send a template that's the language that the sponsor would like to see. But ARB is the one who's responsible for determining that any particular informed consent form is appropriate for protecting the welfare of patients. The basic required elements is that telling the subject or potential subject the study involves research, what research for, how long will the subject be involved in it, what procedures will be performed. Of those procedures, which of those are experimental? Include a description of any reasonably foreseeable risk or discomfort, and I have seen informed consent forms that discuss everything from potential side effects to the drug to pain and discomfort at a needle stick to inject the inflator. And I have to discuss any benefits that may reasonably be expected from the research. And there may be a lot of research studies that there is no reasonable expectation of a benefit for the patient. And that is the case, that has to be disclosed to subjects so they know that in advance. Subjects, especially in diseases that are illnesses, go into a clinical trial with a hope that this clinical trial will help with their care and will help with their disease. And that's not always the case. Sometimes clinical trials are to test things like which dose is the right dose, but not necessarily to anticipate benefit to the subject. The aspect of informed consent is really critical for patients to understand. Now, there are a lot of patients out there who do things for altruistic reasons, and who say, I will do this so my daughter can perhaps have better treatment for this disease when she gets to be my age. But it's very important that the patient understands that there may not be any benefit to them. And the patient also has to understand what alternative procedures or courses of treatment they have. For a phase 4 oncology study, that alternative may be nothing. The alternative to be in the trial may be no further treatment. But for an orthopedic study in a hip replacement for a new device, the alternative may be to get the old version of the device, for example, not the one that's still in the experimental stages. Consent has to provide the subject information about the extent to which confidentiality will be kept, and the fact that the FDA may inspect their records, and the FDA and drug company sponsor will have access to their personal information. There's a discussion whether any medical treatments or compensation are available if injury occurs, how to contact and who to contact in the event of a research-related injury. They hold whom to contact for answers about the research. They understand that participation is completely voluntary, and that if you refuse to participate in the study, you can still see your doctor. You will still get care from this institution. There will not be a discrimination against you because you say no. The subject must understand that they can discontinue participation at any time with penalty or loss of benefit. The informed consent has to be obtained in a way that does not coerce, persuade the subject to participate in a study. And therefore, from an ethical perspective, the informed consent is considered a process, not a document. You will hear about people going to quote-unquote consent a patient. Sounds like that's something that's done to a patient. But for people who study ethics and talk about ethics of informed consent, they always stress that informed consent is a process whereby you are providing information to the subject. They have sufficient opportunity to ask questions, to consider whether or not to participate, have time to maybe take the form home for a day or a week, to discuss it with family and friends, to really have a clear understanding of the study, risks, and benefits and its requirements. No matter how much you've done a good job in informed consent, you'll be surprised at how much a very nervous patient will miss in the session. I've had situations where I've been a monitor and been observing a patient who's about to get injected, and as the patient say, "Nobody told me this was radioactive," and it was imaging agent. That situation, the informed consent process was not effective because that subject did not understand that they were going in with a radioactive treatment. Investigator cannot involve a subject in research unless they first obtain signed informed consent. And so that actually translates to can literally not do anything, can't start the scan, can't take the image, can't draw the first blood sample until the informed consent is obtained. It has to be a document that is IRB approved. It has to be signed and dated at the time of consent. A copy has to be given to the subject. No study procedures may occur until the informed consent has been signed by the subject. And as a monitor, that's something I would really look for. I would look at the date of informed consent and the study procedures. And if there is a study procedure performed the date of that informed consent, that was serious finding for that site. There are special cases to help with non-English speaking subjects. There are translators available often. However, typically a sponsor will insist that the subject is competent enough in English to be able to understand, or will provide a translated consent form. Ways that you can discuss informed consents to people who are illiterate. And there's a concept called assent that is for children who are old enough to understand what's happening and to give their permission, are not considered legal adults. So for anyone who is old enough to have a conversation with, they typically go through a process called assent instead of consent. It's a similar concept that they agree to be in the research study. Revision to the informed consent there has to be revision to the informed consent if the protocol changes and there is a direct impact on the participation. So, for example, if you're doing a clinical trial and 6 months into the trial, the sponsor decides that they're going to add 2 extra blood samples because they find they want to add additional data, informed consent document would have to be updated and revised to include those additional blood samples. Changes to the informed consent may be made if there is a safety event or if there's a change in inclusion criteria or there are new disclosures. Perhaps someone at another site has a severe adverse event and via the appropriate channels, they may decide that the consent form for your institution should be changed to reflect that potential risk. In some cases, you may have to, quote-unquote, reconsent the subject with revised informed consent. They're still on the study. I mean, you'd have to sit down with your subject that you've been seeing and say, you know what, Mr. Smith, there's been a change to the study. I'd like to have you take a look at this consent form, and I'm going to show you what has changed and ask you to, if you are still willing to participate in the study. One of the things that is a huge problem in monitor visits and an FDA audit is the wrong version of the consent form. You've got a protocol, you've got a consent form. Someone takes 10 copies of the consent form and puts them in a folder in the nuclear medicine department. The next time a patient comes in, someone grabs a copy out of that folder and the patient signs up. But unknown to anyone in nuclear medicine, the allergy department had a revision to protocol and had a new informed consent. It happens enough to where it is one of the most common errors found during audit. I do recommend that you not print out a bunch of copies of the consent form. I do recommend that you always go to the most recent form before you discuss with a patient. And actually, a lot of the big institutions now don't even allow you to print out a consent form until you've got an eligible patient. Okay, so we've talked a little bit now about of clinical trials, about people involved in the clinical trials, and about the documents and materials involved in clinical trials. Let's talk a little bit about documentation. Documentation being the old adage that the paperwork's done, or if it's not documented, it was not done. And different methods are used in clinical trials. Electronic, actually. You might get a laptop or an iPad from a sponsor and see how to enter your data into it. But collecting data must be approved by the IRB. Most commonly used is called a case report form, and a case report form is, I should say, not most commonly, but universally used, is a form called a case report form, although it can be printed or it can be kind of an electronic format, and where all the data is from all the testing that you're going to do on the clinical trial. For example, if protocol says you have to have a pregnancy test before the patient gets the investigational drug, there needs to be somewhere on a case report form that you document that the test was completed and on a date that's prior to the injection of the investigational drug and what the results of it were. Case forms are the place where the data is housed, and that's what gets sent into the sponsor for entering into a large database of information, as opposed to the source document. The source document is the first place that something is written out, or the first place that something is captured. Sometimes it's referred to as the original document, or the original record. And in the nuclear medicine department, it's where we wrote it down first. So if your dose is 10 millicuries, and you go to bring it to the hot lab and you write down the residual on a piece of paper that's in your pocket, where on that residual activity, that is the source document. That scrap of paper, therefore, becomes the thing that must be monitored. It must be saved in the patient's records, and is what the monitor will compare with what is written in the case report form. Now, of course, we try to avoid writing things on little scraps of paper, our hand, or our lab coat, or anything like that. Sponsors will often provide a source document worksheet that allows you to have a place to write things down for the first time, or sometimes as a research site you may create your own source document that goes along with the case report form, but allows you to capture that data for the first time. Documents include any kind of printout, like an EKG printout, drug dispensing records. If you're doing of blood in a well counter, for example, and you get the little printout strip, that printed strip of paper with on it is the source document and must stay. And that's important. It's called the clinical study report. And when I was doing clinical trials as a study coordinator, I was never really that aware of the clinical study report, what it was and how critical it was. But the written description of the study, it is a document that, from the pharmaceutical sponsor's point of view, is a culmination of all of the work that went into doing that protocol. It describes what the protocol is. It includes everything that happens. It includes all of the clinical results, such as the lab tests and the results of the EKGs and any outliers. It provides a statistical description of the event and analysis of the data, and comes to a conclusion about the entire clinical report. Or clinical trial report, I've heard it called, something that as soon as they get that last piece of data in from a site, they add it into the database and then lock the database and start analyzing data. And so usually a clinical study report takes several months to write at the end of a clinical trial. And as a researcher, you may not see it, but it is what is housed by the sponsor as the result of that study. And a term that you may hear is the electronic data capture, EDC. Electronic data capture is essentially an electronic way to do case report forms, but you do it by entering, not just scanning in case report forms, but by actually collecting clinical trial into the permanent electronic form. The electronic data capture is actually in great favor and has a lot of advantages over traditional case report forms, but it's some additional things about electronic data because there are requirements for access, proving security, proving a trail to see that no one has any error or intentional bias into the data. The data transmittal form or an imaging transmittal form, that's usually a form where a CRO has you send it in with the study. Frequently, it's made by the CRO. You get it, and you'll be asked to either fax it in, email it in, or send it on with the transfer of images. It's what a CRO uses to compare with what you were supposed to do. So, for example, let's say, the date and the time of the image, and they'll look at the raw data and make sure that the date and the time on the DICOM stamp match up. Now, if you have if there's something that doesn't match up, for example, you can electronic data in the form of image files, and there is a scan that's done at a 256 mix, and your study protocol requires that you to get a 128 because they were trying to go for standardization from site to site. You might get a query or a DCF, the clarification form, two terms for the same thing, and that's a request for you to clarify some aspect of the data. So you may get a query on a case report form where you're documenting, things about the patient site, some other procedure, or you may get a query on an image file that says, this DICOM header says you injected FDG, but you actually injected FLT. Can you give me a signed document that says it actually was FLT that was injected, for example? Or, this If file is coming in with the ingest time at 10:02, what you wrote down in the case report format you injected at 10:07, please provide clarification to me about what the correct time is. Query data clarification forms are a necessary evil in clinical trials. We try to keep those to a minimum by having the data be very clean and submitted. We don't get a lot of questions on it. And a really good imaging site in a clinical trial will have a low number of queries because they will send things in great shape to begin with. You want to try to minimize how many times the CRO or the sponsor has to come back to you for clarification on data. There's another form that's used with regard to data capture, and that is the Delegation of Responsibility law. The list of individuals, we talked in the beginning about the principal investigator delegates people to work. So this is an example of a delegation of responsibility law where you would put your name, you put your title, your responsibilities, maybe injecting or maybe reading scans, you have a CV available, the date you were involved in the study, your initials, and then the initials of the principal or primary investigator that says, yes, I approve this technologist to inject and scan on this study. The data to and from are important because some studies go on for years, and so different people will come in and take over different responsibilities for the trial. And some investigators have their residents and fellows participate as sub-investigators because they're often the people that help out in clinic, and they have rotations or times when they're in the department only for 6 months or a year, and so it's really important to have this. The study coordinator is the one who's responsible for keeping the log up to date. There's a log called a drug accountability log that has to keep all of this information on it. If the drug you're studying is a radioactive drug and an imaging agent, that's actually above and beyond all the records that you have to do from a radiation safety point of view. So just be aware that there's additional accountability. Okay, let's move on to some things, some study events and some terms that you need to know in terms of clinical research. Progression is a variation from the process or procedure defined in a protocol. Usually when you have a protocol deviation, it's something that you can't avoid. You missed a blood draw because the line clotted, or you missed getting the EKG exactly on time. You got it 5 minutes late because the patient had used the restroom to spend. Typically, you can still use that subject's data. It's maybe one data point that is an outlier. The other thing is a protocol exception. That's when you talk to the sponsor in advance and say, I actually to enroll this patient, his CT was supposed to have been within 30 days, but his CT was 1 day ago. But I'd like to enroll this patient because I think this is a good candidate for the trial. The sponsor can look at that request and make a decision about accepting that deviation in advance, and that's called a protocol exception. Progression, however, is something that's quite serious, and that's a significant departure from the processes or procedures required by the protocol. An example of a serious protocol violation is if the informed consent was signed after study procedures were done. Sometimes that results in the data not even being used in the clinical trial. A significant violation may require that you are discontinued from participating in the study, and too many violations would be a cause to put on the site for future research. The concept of adverse reaction and adverse event warrants some discussion as well. An adverse reaction means any adverse event caused by a drug Suspected adverse reaction is any adverse event for which there is reasonable possibility that the drug that you're studying implies a lesser degree of certainty about causality than an adverse reaction. So an adverse reaction is, I injected this investigational drug, I'm pretty sure that that is what caused this adverse event. Suspected adverse reaction means I injected an investigational drug, there was an adverse event. I think there's a reasonable possibility it could be caused by the investigation drug. A term called adverse event or adverse experience, and that is any untoward medical occurrence that happens, whether or not it is drug-related, and it's defined as any unfavorable and unintended sign, symptom, of disease temporally or in a timely manner associated with the use of the drug without judging about causality. Any use of the drug and that means any use of the drug, not just using it within the protocol, but if it's used off-label, etc., that is considered an adverse event. Adverse event is a subset of adverse events that are reported to regulatory and oversight groups, such as the IRB, such as the sponsor, etc. And, you know, there's some term that's not as well standardized as maybe it should be in the industry. So you could hear it called serious adverse experience, cited adverse event, adverse drug reaction. You want to avoid SE because that could be serious adverse experience or significant adverse experience or suspected. And so those would have very different meanings. Serious AE is untoward medical occurrence, as we previously described, but that causes any one of the following outcomes: a life-threatening experience, inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of an existing hospitalization, persistent significant disability or incapacity, or congenital anomaly or a birth defect. Now, events that don't require those things may be considered serious, and based on medical judgment of the PI, they may jeopardize the subject and make their intervention to prevent one of the outcomes listed before, meaning death, incapacity, etc. The sponsor or the investigator believes that the event is serious, the event must be considered serious, evaluated by the sponsor for expedited reporting. So if the sponsor says, I think this was really serious, and the investigator says, no, I don't think it meets the definition, it automatically meets the definition, and vice versa. If the investigator says, I believe this is a serious event, and the sponsor says, no, I don't think it wasn't going to evolve to one of those things, the fact that one of them believes it is makes automatically categorized as serious. How do you report it, and what do you do? Well, the sponsor provides the reporting period specifically for that drug. So, for a tracer, for example, the AE reporting period might be 24 hours, meaning that you inject FAG, for example, or let's take an investigation tracer, FLT. 20 hours later, or 30 hours later, the patient has some event, they have cancer and they have some shortness of breath that is possibly a result of chemo. We don't consider that within the AE window of the FLT because we've already defined the window. But if shortness of breath occurs at what the reporting period is designated by the sponsor as 24 hours, and if it occurred 20 hours after the injection of FLT, that is within the AE reporting window and must be recorded by the investigator on the case report form. And for a long-lived isotope, the reporting period may be longer, maybe 30 days. For a chemotherapy drug, it may be the entire year that the patient is on the drug. may require a follow-up visit to assess AE, and understand that serious AEs can happen to any subject at any time. Everybody needs to know how to report AE. Now, expected versus unexpected. Any drug has a list of expected reactions. And so, for example, we know that some drugs, if you're testing a pharmacologic test agent for nuclear cardiology, you know that it's likely that the patient will get, that many patients will have a feeling of heat or a flushing sensation. That's all kind of written down in the expectations of that drug. So a subject who has that would be not considered unexpected, it would be expected. But not listed, and something that doesn't already known about, AE is then considered unexpected, and it raises its level of importance. Here are some examples. Edema, for example, is anticipated to occur in some patients who get ACE inhibitors, and could be described in the investigator brochure as a class effect, meaning all ACE inhibitors have this, therefore this new ACE inhibitor we think will fit. But the first case of angioedema observed with the drug under investigation is considered unexpected, because they've had one before, so it's the first one, and therefore it's unexpected. Another example, like the third bullet point here, if the investigational brochure lists CAs, the occurrence of vasculitis or thromboembolism would be unexpected by virtue of greater specificity. The investigational brochure says CVAs, but now we've got these other very specific things that were not listed in the investigational brochure, therefore they are considered unexpected. This is where you have to kind of think about doing a study with a PET scanning agent. He falls down and Trypsin falls down 6 steps after her research PET scan and is hospitalized overnight for rib fracture and possible concussion. Is it an adverse event? Is it a serious adverse event? Is a serious adverse drug reaction? Is unexpected? And before you think you know the answer, you need to ask yourself, is anything in the investigational brochure about hypotension, about dizziness, about fainting? If the patient reports feeling dizzy prior to the fall, is it unexpected? If the patient is dizzy after the scan, is that an adverse event? Well, a patient is hospitalized overnight who had an investigational drug injected, this would be a serious adverse event. But according to the investigator, it is unrelated to the tracer. It is probably not a serious adverse drug reaction. Affected, if there's nothing that is related to the drug, it would not be considered unexpected because it's not drug related. But if the patient was dizzy after the scan for a couple of hours, that would be an unexpected adverse reaction. Here's another, for example, a look at scenario 3. It comes into the imaging department 24 hours after chemo. He had mild nausea 45 minutes after being injected with the tracer. Well, of course he's got nausea. He's, chemo 24 hours ago. Had nausea 45 minutes after being injected with the tracer. Whether you believe or not that it is caused by the tracer, it still is an adverse event. And the general rule of CITE is you record all adverse events, and the sponsor and the investigator together decide if it is an adverse reaction. So people get confused between medical history, AE, and concomitant illness. history is anything that started before the injection of the investigational product. So a patient who has a history of low back pain, who complains of low back pain on the scanning table, and about the same as it always is, my back always hurts about this much, that just goes into medical history. It doesn't go into the AE. It is worse when the table than it usually is. That's probably an adverse event that needs to be reported because it's a worsening of a existing condition. Concomitant illness is something that started before the AE reporting window and continues unchanged. The patient has nosebleeds because of chemotherapy that they're on, and had a couple nosebleeds during the time they were in the PET department, but they're unchanged. It's the same frequency, no worsening. That it really is typically reported as a concomitant illness that's happening at the same time as the clinical trial, but not related to the clinical trial. Your study monitor can provide advice on completing the case report form. Reviewing adverse events is really a priority for monitors and for the FDA. You have the subject's medical records available because you have to look at the whole event. And if the patient was in the emergency room or in, hospitalized, you need to have those records available for the monitor to look at. And case report forms tend to be fairly involved because they have to list all events with regard to whether or not it was caused by the drug, the start of the event, the frequency of the event. Did it occur once, intermittent, or continuous? Expected versus unexpected. How serious is it, and how intense it is? It could be severe, meaning did it cause death or incapacity, or was it mild, moderate, or severe? Both of those terms are reported. Use a standard kind of dictionary of terms called the common toxicity criteria, and document whether or not the PI considers it to be caused by the drug or not. An example of one adverse event case report form, it was graded as unrelated all the way to definite. The attribution was unrelated to the drug all the way up to score to definite. Was it expected or unexpected? Was it serious, yes or no, by those definitions that I showed you? Which was taken? What was the start and resolution date, or is it ongoing? Here's another example of an adverse event form where the AE is numbered, it's described, it's serious, whether it's yes or no, one for yes, two for no, date of onset, date of resolution, or is it continuing? The grade, using common toxicity criteria. Frequency, the action taken with the study drug, with the study drug discontinued, action taken, and then the relationship to the study drug. Guides exist on how, when, and what AEs have to be reported to the FDA sponsor and IRB. The bottom line is, as a site, you record every AE, and the sponsor determines what goes into the FDA. Reporting is one of the most challenging but extremely important part of clinical research trial. And the FDA final rule oversees all studies and all safety reports under an IND. There were changes fairly recently in March of 2011 that not everybody's aware of, and that's when the new reporting requirements came into play. What and how investigators report to IRB and the FDA. The purpose was streamlining safety reporting. What was happening before was the sponsor was submitting all AEs, not even the ones that were unrelated and the ones that were not serious. The new rule provides the guidelines that they really only have to submit the serious related to the drug adverse events. By doing this streamlined. It provides an improvement of patient safety by making sure that you report in a timely manner. Investigators should always report AEs on the consent form, report all of them. With IRB to determine if non-serious AEs need to be reported. Some IRBs require all serious AEs to be reported IRB. Some require all of them. So it's up to you to check with your IRB. It has to come and monitor and retrieve the AEs. It has to include a summary of all AEs in an annual report. And per new guidance in March of 2011, no additional reporting to the FDA or to the other investigators for non-serious AEs are required. If there's a serious AE at your site, you must report immediately to the sponsor. And that's typically within 24 hours, but you would never wait 24 hours. You would, as soon as you became aware of the event. If you come into work on Monday morning and you find out that your subject was hospitalized Friday night, you let sponsor immediately to let them know that subject is hospitalized. The study then would be determined by the investigator. The sponsor is going to request follow-up information, and then the sponsor determines if this is a serious AE that must be reported in an expedited manner. The sponsor submit a special report, an IND safety report, or investigational new drug safety report, if it's a adverse reaction, serious, unexpected, and has to meet all three conditions. So if it's said to be related to the drug, if it's serious by the definition that I do, and it's unexpected, it must be put into the special report. You don't need an IND safety report for something that's serious and unexpected but related to the drug, or suspected to be related to the drug and it's serious but it's not unexpected. So it has to meet all three criteria for an IND safety report. And the pharmaceutical company goes on the clock. If the serious AE meets all three, they have to be filed with the FDA by sponsor within 50 days of when they are notified. If it meets all reporting criteria and is fatal or life-threatening, they have less time to follow up. They have to report it within 7 days and then provide a follow-up by day 15. A graphic that describes what happens. You've got a 15-day reporting period for unexpected adverse reactions. Okay, related to the drug, serious and unexpected. If the event is fatal or life-threatening, you will have 7 days to report. Then you will follow up with 7 days with the patient and report back by day 15. There are a lot of methods that are used to report adverse events for people that are not working with the sponsor who are doing some other trials. So, for example, if you're on National Cancer Institute study, you use an adverse event reporting system called ADEARS, Adverse Event Expedited Reporting System. National studies or multinational studies use this organization. For international organizations of medical sciences, they have an online or a paper reporting tool that sponsors will adopt and use in their trials. Sponsors who do U.S. trials often will use just the FDA form. And FDA actually has an online reporting tool that can be used as well. So there's a lot of ways to report these. This is, for example, what the online tool for the FDA MedWatch program for safety reporting is. Here's what the online reporting tool looks like for the CIOM's international reporting of adverse drug reactions. Whether or not you have to report this adverse reaction to the IRB depends on their guidelines. Most IRBs will want you to tell them of a serious AE whether or not it is unexpected. However, they may want to know more than that. They may want to know of all AEs. They certainly ask about all AEs in the annual reporting period, but they want to know about all suspected adverse actions, for example. That you'll need to check with their specific guidelines. To close out the section on data, how long do you have to keep stuff? Storage actually is usually at a premium, and people have trouble knowing how long they have to keep their paper files if they've done case report forms. And here's the rule. Following approval of the last marketing application, and that data was used to support. So, for example, you participated in a phase 3 clinical trial in 2005, and that drug for which that data was collected got approved by the FDA in 2010. So after 2012, you discard that data. Not just in 2005, but in 2007, the company formally discontinued work on that drug. Then you could get rid of that data. Or there are more strict regulations. You would have to abide by the national or local laws, regulations, and customs. And from a sponsor's perspective, we never want you to destroy data. If it gets to the 2 years following approval time period, you as a sponsor, we would notify you and say, please send, box it all up and send it to us. Usually people are paying storage fees for that data by that time. And so, people are often anxious to get rid of that, but you must not destroy data prior to these time periods. All accrued data relating to individuals who cease participating in it are to be maintained. You've got a subject number 003, and they dropped out 2 weeks into a 4-week study. Their data must be maintained, including their informed consent form and all of the study-related data that you have from them. Electronic records have to be accessible throughout the entire period. So if you have electronic records to store data, they need to be able to get in and access those records at any time during that retention period, which can be somewhat costly because sometimes you need to keep open websites and data storage available to external parties, and sometimes there's a fee for that, but that's what's required. An auditor, whether it's FDA, another regulatory authority such as the National Cancer Institute, sponsor representatives, when they want to come in and look at study records, these are all the records that they're going to want to look for and that you are required to give them access to. Accountability, all informed consent, of the regulatory documents, some case history, approvals and correspondence, and imaging records for the subject. Then when you're a study coordinator and you know that a monitor is coming, and it feels a little bit like you're being inspected, and it feels a little bit nerve-making because you want to have everything together. But I find as a monitor, I have the best results when I help the site feel like helping them prepare for an FDA audit. On your side, as a site, I want you to have all the data that will show up FDA audit. So I'm going to help you bring your site up to compliance. So if you look at your monitoring visits as a way to prepare for an FDA audit, you'll be much more productive with those visits. FDA can't notify a sponsor, notify a site that they plan to inspect you. I would want to, if you ever received this Form 8042 notice of inspection, you would to notify your sponsor that that is happening. because the FDA isn't going to necessarily give a courtesy call to the sponsor, but they're going to want to know what's going on. Might pre-announced by telephone, but might not be. And audits are conducted during normal business hours. So they're going to ask you to stay until midnight to go through data. So business hours and start back up in the morning. You are allowed to ask to see credentials of the FDA personnel. You are instructed to answer only what is asked and to not offer extra information. If you think of this like a radiation safety inspection, you always answer truthfully. You don't necessarily go into long paragraphs of explaining this or that when you weren't specifically asked for it. You are eligible to request a summary of any findings at the end of each day, and you will get a Form 482 if there are any significant deviations to the auditor. Action is done, you'll receive word from the FDA that you have either a no action indicated, which means nothing wrong, nothing you need to do, but action indicated, which means that, you know, there are some things that we think were perfect, but we're not necessarily going to take administrative action. And the official action indicated, which are most serious, and that says that there are serious objectionable conditions found here, and that regulatory action, such as suspending the site, is recommended. About an hour and almost hour and a half walk through clinical trials. And so these last 6 slides kind of some of the things that we touched upon. So I'm hoping as we go through these, you can have a mental note of things that you learned. As I said at the beginning of the talk, it's kind of like a 90-minute talk on radiation safety. You definitely won't learn to be an RSO, but you will learn some things to keep you safe. Hope that this talk has actually done that for you. That you've learned some of the lingo and the acronyms, that you understand now the criticality of GCP compliance. The Department of Health and Human Services oversees the FDA, and the FDA oversees the protection of human subjects. That 21 Part 312 governs procedures for a new drug application. Clinical practices, or the E6 document, is more stringent and provides more detail on how to conduct a trial, but an FDA auditor is going to measure you against 21 CFR 312. You've reviewed a little bit that the IRB protects the rights, safety, and well-being of study subjects. Contracts and documents between the sponsor and the investigator are binding, and that the PI is ultimately responsible for study activity at that site. Imaging personnel must abide by the study protocol as well as follow the parameters outlined in the imaging manual. That you not have any study-related tests without first signing an informed consent, and that the informed consent has basic elements that must be in place. But before the study begins, you need to train your staff and train replacements before they conduct study tasks. Very familiar with the study protocol and imaging manual, and your responsibilities. If you don't get worksheets provided by the sponsor, develop your own forms and checklists to make sure that you've done everything that the protocol says, and have a plan for organizing your records. I've learned that you want to limit protocol violations and deviations, and also you want to limit the number of queries that you get. You want to come familiar with different study events such as adverse reactions and adverse events, what expected versus unexpected. And you understand that the key responsibility of monitors when they come into your site is to review those AE case report forms. They must have all the documentation available. And that you have, under that, the new adverse event reporting, which dated the state but went into effect in March of 2020, will help determine the causality of AEs and streamline safety reporting. Understand that as a person at a site, you must report all serious AEs immediately to the sponsor. And the sponsor must report an AE to the FDA if it is a suspected adverse reaction and unexpected. I understood now that the sponsor has reporting criteria, either 15 or 7 days to report an AE, that reports that go into the FDA must also go to the IRB. The records have to be maintained at least 2 years after the approval of the drug or the discontinuation of the research. That authorized representatives from the FDA, the sponsor, and other agencies a right to inspect study documents and medical records related to the study, and so that informed consent has to mention that fact. I leave you with a couple pages of references. You can quickly learn a lot about clinical trials by going to www.ich.org and www.fda.gov. There's a lot of really helpful guidances and slide presentations about clinical trials. Interesting talk on the web about given by an FDA inspector of how to prepare for medical device inspection that I recommend, and that is very, very useful. Finally, I'd like to say thank you for your attention. This is a longer talk, but I hope that you have just walked through some important language of clinical trials. Thank you very much.